Hey everyone, welcome to the channel, and I'm here for a ranking video for you guys. Now for this video, I'm going to be ranking the big three of progressive metal. Now I've done a ranking for the big four of thrash metal, so I figured, hey, why not do one for progressive metal? Now some of you guys may not even realize that there is a big three of progressive metal, but you're about to find out who those bands are in this video. Now this is a rather tough ranking because keep in mind that there is no bad band in the big three of prog metal. I think all three of these bands are really great bands. Now, this list, this ranking could change. That is something to keep in mind. But I would say that there is a chance that this list is pretty much set in stone. But who knows? Now, if I were to do this list in 2019, I mean, this list would probably be a lot different. I mean, a lot different, like maybe complete opposite different. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into the ranking. We're going to go from worst to best, and saying worst isn't really saying much since, well, once again, there's no bad band in the big three. So, at number 3, I got to go with Queensryche. Now, I think some people might agree that Queensryche is the weakest of the big three, and now, the reason that I have Queensryche last in this ranking is because, well, they're just not as consistent as the other bands on this list. I mean, they've definitely had a lot more weaker material than the other bands have on this list. I mean, in the 2000s era of Queensryche, I mean, it's pretty much inexcusable, I'd say. I mean, they really started out putting out their weakest material, I'd say. Now, don't get it twisted, Queensryche has had a lot of great albums too, especially in the 80s and the 90s era. I mean, of course, you had The Warning, Rage for Order, which was the album that got me into them. Operation Mindcrime, which is one of the best metal concept albums of all time, I would say. Empire, pretty commercial, but still very good. You also have Promised Land, which I think is underrated. But yeah, there's definitely some great albums from Queensryche. Now, even the Todd Latour era, I think, is really good. All three albums with him are very solid, I'd say. Now, I would say that you know, Queensryche, if I were to do this list in 2019, I probably, believe it or not, would have had Queensryche at the top. I think mainly because that was the year where, you know, I really listened to Queensryche. I mean, I listened to them a lot that year, like easily one of my most listened to bands of that year. So that's why I said earlier that, you know, if I were to make this list then, this list would have probably been the complete opposite. But yeah. Still a great band. Now, Jeff Tate, obviously his era has, you know, kind of gone downhill, at least with the last few albums with him on vocals, but I know he's pursuing solo stuff, and yeah, I mean, he's a good singer, but, you know, the later Queensryche albums with him on vocals, not the greatest, but thankfully Todd Latour is the reason that this band is back on track. But yeah, Queensryche, great bands, but they easily have to be the last on this ranking. Now, the next band at number 2, I'm going to go with Fate's Warning. Now, right off the bat, you probably already know how this ranking is, but I got to go with Fate's Warning at number 2 because, well, of course, they're a great band, and they are one of the pioneers of progressive metal, and they're definitely worthy of being in the big three. Definitely a great band, definitely a lot more consistent than Queensryche, for sure, and I think that's definitely one of the reasons why nowadays I prefer Fate's Warning over Queensryche. To me, I don't think Fate's Warning has really had any bad albums, you know, like, now sure, there are some albums that are, you know, not as great as others, you know, specifically the 2000s era, and even, I know some people don't like Darkness in a Different Light, which I don't mind that album. Yes, it's one of their weakest, but I don't mind that album. I know some people don't like Disconnected or X as well. Those albums I think are okay. I mean, and even with that said, even though I think the 2000s and early 2010s material from Fate's Warning, even though I think it's some of their weakest work, it's still not bad, so therefore this band has never released a bad album. It's hard to say which era of this band I would say is the best. I mean, because, well, once again, this band is very consistent. Of course, you know, in the 80s, you had No Exit and Perfect Symmetry. Those albums especially, I think, are really good. The late 80s albums, I think, are very solid. I do prefer Ray's era of Fate's Warning over the previous vocalist. I can't remember what his name is, but I mean, he's not a bad vocalist, don't get me wrong. I think he's very good, actually, but I just prefer Ray Outer. But yeah, definitely a lot of solid material from Fate's Warning. Even the modern era of Fate's Warning is really good. Theories of Flight, and of course the most recent one, Long Day, Good Night. But yeah, definitely a great band. And they had a pretty strong 90s point as well, especially with Parallels, Inside Out, and A Pleasant Shade of Grey, which is arguably one of their best albums. I would say it's one of their best. I know some people don't like Inside Out, but I actually really like that album. There's a lot of great songs on that album. But yeah, definitely a really solid band. Definitely worth checking out if you're into old school metal or progressive metal. Definitely check out Fate's Warning. I mean, it is hard because honestly, it's kind of tempting putting these guys at number one. But to me, the number one band in the big three of progressive metal, you already know what it is. It's Dream Theater. Now, like I said, if you were to ask me to do this list in 2019, this list would have been completely opposite. Therefore, I probably would have had Dream Theater at the bottom. Yes, even below Queensryche. I mean, that's how insane I was at the time, I guess. I mean, I think the reason that I preferred Queensryche for the longest time is just because, they're more like old school metal than Dream Theater is. But I would say that both bands are. I mean, Dream Theater definitely has elements of old school metal and even some old school rock as well. You can tell that Dream Theater is heavily inspired and influenced by bands such as Yes and Rush and, many prog bands like them. But Dream Theater, they have to take the cake for me as the number one best band in the big three of prog. Now, Dream Theater, I also would say that they've never had a bad album. Now, that is a little controversial to say because I know that there's some people, actually a lot of people, that don't like the album The Astonishing, which to me, what is my stance on that album? I actually don't mind the album. I don't think it's as bad as some people claim it to be. I mean, there is some good songs on that album. Yes, it's not one of their best, but I think The Astonishing, for what it is a pretty good album, even though it may be their weakest album, but still not bad. I know some people don't like the self-titled album either, but there's a lot of great songs on that album. I mean, it's got Illumination Theory, I believe that's the song. It's the epic off the album, pretty good. You also got The Enemy Inside, which I think is actually one of the best singles of their modern era. But yeah, definitely a great album as well. Again, not one of their best, but still a good album. But I would say that the best time for Dream Theater was the 90s. And the reason I say that is because in the 90s you had Images and Words and Awake, which I think are their best. But there's a lot of other great albums in the 90s, especially Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory. That's another one of their best, I would say. So yeah, the 90s is easily the best era for Dream Theater, I'd say. You also had Falling Into Infinity in the 90s as well, which I know some people don't like that album. I mean, some people say that that's one of their weakest, which I personally don't agree with. I mean, I like that album. I think it's better than The Astonishing and the self-titled. I also think it's better than, what's that album? Systematic Chaos. Systematic Chaos is a good album, but I would actually say that that's one of their weakest as well. Now, Octavarium, I used to say that this album was overrated, but this is an album that's actually growing on me recently. I mean, this is an album that I've been returning to a lot, especially with certain songs like The Root of All Evil, I Walk Beside You, Sacrifice Sons, the title track. There's a lot of great songs on that album. Octavarium is a great album, though. I can definitely understand the hype for it a little bit more now than I did before. I know that some people also complain about James LaBrie's vocals. I mean, that's actually a common complaint that I've heard with Dream Theater and why some people can't get into them. Something that I have heard actually recently was they say that they like the music that Dream Theater creates, like the musicianship, but they just can't get past the vocals for some reason. The vocals, they take time. I think that's the case. I know that was the case with me, and maybe that was one of the reasons why for the longest time I had Dream Theater at the bottom, is because of James LaBrie's vocals. But I actually really like James LaBrie's vocals. Actually, I think he's actually a very good vocalist. So, all in all, Dream Theater, they have to be my number one for the big three of progressive metal. Well, there you have it. That is my ranking for the big three of prog metal. Let me know what you think. How would you rank the big three? So, with that being said, thanks for watching. Have a nice day and take care.